Hello, and welcome once again to The Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at The American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, associate editor for the Claremont Review of Books and exploding tree editor for The American Mind. I am joined this week, as per usual, by managing editor Mike Sabo and publisher and president Ryan Williams. And you guys, ICE is killing people all over the country in more ways than one. I'm sorry to make light of these events, but couldn't help myself. The ICE-related puns just kind of come tumbling out of me. This is a serious subject, however, and it is pretty remarkable how often we have talked in 2026 about Minnesota on this podcast. It was not on my bingo card that Minneapolis would become the kind of swirling hub of budding insurgency, or that it would be the site of a number of immigration enforcement related tragedies. But here we are. This is apparently the year that we're in. So last week, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the killing of Renée Good who was shot by Jonathan Ross. And so in that context, we discussed both the Antifa and Antifa adjacent tactics that might have led unwitting or naive protesters in Minneapolis to trifle with law enforcement in ways that will ultimately provoke disaster. And we mentioned that this protest, ongoing, rolling kind of movement in Minneapolis continues to escalate. And since we talked last, it's claimed another casualty. This is Alex Pretti. I believe he was a nurse, 37 years old. And I'm going to do my best to lay out what happens in the video of this event, and then we can editorialize on it afterward. The videos I've seen, when they begin, Pretti is already sort of filming ICE agents and interacting with traffic, directing traffic in some cases. He's also seems to be together with a number of women who are kind of in an adversarial relationship with ICE agents. Some of them take shelter behind him. He gets into an increasingly heated confrontation with ICE. ICE starts using pepper spray on the women and on him. Then as the kind of conflict escalates, Pretti ends up on the ground. It looks like ICE agents take a gun off of him, and that gun has since been, I believe, submitted as evidence in what one hopes will be a full and thorough investigation. And really kind of close in time to that event, when they take the gun off of him, ICE starts firing with at least, multiple shots, around 10 or so, it seems, all told. Pretti's on the ground. And we know now that he was killed. So that's my best attempt at a summary of the video. Everyone should watch what they can and draw their own conclusions. But of course, this has been filed away in the ongoing saga of escalation in Minneapolis and beyond Minneapolis, actually. The whole state of Minnesota has really been involved, kind of pulled into this. We've talked before, and I imagine we'll talk now, about the kind of effort to make these people into the Floyds of the Ice Age, if you will, the sort of martyrs for the left against Trump's harsher immigration measures. There's also the factor of a kind of big ICE hiring push that recently went through, and the question, to what extent are these guys getting adequate training? Finally, there seems to now be movement between Donald Trump and Tim Walz about whether or not they can kind of come to some sort of agreement. Trump, ever the deal maker, has started telling the press that he seems like actually, he can get along with Walz and they want the same thing, and he's going to send Tom Homan, the border czar, in there to settle things down and clear things up. You guys can tell me if I missed anything, but we've talked now about Renée Good. We've talked about the Don Lemon and the Baptists, and we've talked about Alex Pretti. The casualties seem to be rising. There are midterms up ahead. What do you make of all this?
We should say from the outset, too, that due to some technical difficulties, we'll apologize especially to our faithful and loyal listeners and viewers. Last week's podcast, I'm sure many of you noticed, did not go up until Sunday, although we recorded it Tuesday. Usually it goes up a day and a half or so after we record. So I apologize if some of our ice and or Greenland stuff seemed a little dated by Sunday. But in our defense, I will say that we predicted Greenland pretty well on Tuesday. But that's all probably moot at this point if you're waiting eagerly for a podcast that usually drops on Wednesday or Thursday. So our apologies about that. We should be back on track this week. It's hard to conclude anything other than the fiasco in Minneapolis. And I'm laying aside right now who's to blame for what. But just to say, it's been a good 3 weeks or so for the left. The large Somali fraud thing in Minnesota to the tune of many, many billions. So completely out of the news cycle as this ICE enforcement action met by what could only be described as a low-level domestic insurgency of sorts, pretty well organized. A lot of people have been collating this sort of evidence, but it's pretty sophisticated tactics. There's plenty of trainings on all of this. If any of you want to learn more about this, go to AmericanMind.org. Piece went up yesterday from Kyle Scheidler, who Spencer mentioned we had on 2 weeks ago, who is an expert and studier of left-wing extremist groups and tactics. And the left-wing agitation in Minneapolis, which is not, or a large part of it, which we've discussed before, does not seem to be substantially First Amendment protesting. But a good portion of it and a very well-organized portion of it is trailing vehicles, signal chats updating, tracking ICE members, obstruction at any point at which ICE wants to arrest a criminal, blowing of whistles, interposing of bodies in between federal law enforcement and possible detainees and deportees, et cetera, et cetera. Pretti was wrapped up in all of that, or Pretti, I should say. Is it Pretti? Pretti was wrapped up in all of that. And I'm reluctant to pass any judgment on the shooting. I mean, you can watch endless slow motion and various angled videos of this, and it seems to me the video evidence is inconclusive, at least to non-expert eyes. I don't know. I suspect they'll investigate it. But the general takeaway is it seems to me, and this is a version of the Renée Good thing, it seems to me it's a very bad idea to obstruct federal law enforcement while armed. Now, he has a Second Amendment right to carry, walking around, even protesting, but getting in fisticuffs or an altercation, physical altercation with multiple federal law enforcement officials, which looks to me like the normal tactic of this sort of Antifa training, which is to de-arrest, to interpose oneself, to try to pull the person away from law enforcement, all a very ill-conceived plan. And unfortunately, another person's dead because of it. I think the Waltz thing is interesting. I noticed yesterday, I think local police seem to be out in new and substantial force and full riot gear, including a couple of pictures of these trucks that I forget what it's called, but they have some sort of crowd control energy beam thing that somebody who seemed to know on the internet, when someone asked, what do those things do? What is that? And they said, well, it's when it's pointed at you, it makes your brain itch in a very uncomfortable way. So the local law enforcement seems to be much more involved now, both in protecting ICE officers at their hotels and generally trying to disperse rowdy mobs. So the Trump maximalists, I guess just the cheerleaders online say that the Trump totally vindicated. He has won. Waltz is back down. All of that may be half true. I don't know. We'll see. But it seems like this has been a major PR and narrative win for the left. And by the left, we could run the whole gamut from local politicians, from Waltz to Mayor Frey or Fry, to There were rumors circulating online that at least one local elected official was an administrator for one of these signal apps groups that organizes some of these, I don't want to call them protests, but this interposition operation going on by Antifa and its allies, or generally the activist left. So it's a hard thing. There's some numbers, and I'll be quiet after this so we can discuss it. I mean, it's hard to describe this as a win for Trump, the recent weeks in Minneapolis. G. Elliott Morris, who's kind of a left of center pollster, runs a Substack called Strength in Numbers. He tries to stick to his data. I mean, he certainly does not have the ideological commitments of the Claremont Institute, but he seems to be a fairly straight shooter with the grains of salt that he is inclined to push a certain version of events in his favor or his party's favor or his inclinations favor. But Trump has really slid. We discussed this last week. Trump has slid considerably on what was considered to be his major issue, which is immigration. I mean, it's dropped basically by Morris's accounting, and you can plus or minus at 5, but even if you do that, it's still bad. Has dropped 18 points since Trump took office.
We did, by the way, call this in our late released episode, and have been calling it that this is going to be hard.
It's kind of a 23% net shift against Trump on overall. And then, and he went from +8 net approval on immigration to roughly -10 now, another 18-point shift. So, and the support for abolishing ICE amongst the general public has gone from about 40% to roughly 47%. So not the end of the world, but the numbers, it's hard to call Minneapolis anything other than a failure for the Trump administration. Now, I said I was going to shut up, but I have one more thing. We should say all of that while also saying Trump and the administration is in a pretty precarious position. I think they've been pretty reluctant to go nuclear and invoke the Insurrection Act or send in troops, because from folks who are in a position to know in the administration, smart lawyers suspect they'd get enjoined immediately. It might even be fast-tracked to the Supreme Court. So there's just so many unknowns in escalating this. I think maybe the best solution is what has been done to reverse a couple of weeks of pretty bad coverage that seems to have dented Trump, which is to change leadership, get Kristi Noem off the stage, get this known professional law enforcement expert in Tom Homan into the place to try to shift the narrative where it should be, in my opinion, which is this is one of the few counties in America where ICE has a huge problem executing warrants on criminals and executing deportation orders. A lot of the rest of the country, it's not a problem at all. Texas, for example, where I am, the numbers are much, much higher for deportations and apprehensions, and you don't really see much of this in the news outside of the occasional Dallas or Fort Worth protest from maybe a week ago with this flare-up for ICE. So, it's I don't want to say it's an untenable position for Trump in Minneapolis, but I think some sort of shift and pivot is necessary, and I think that's what Homan is, coupled with, it looks like, the removal of Bovino, the Border Patrol guy who's heading all this up. So something to watch, and it's just a sad state of affairs for America that the enforcement of immigration and illegal immigration law at the federal level, especially in states where it's been neglected, sanctuary cities, et cetera, it seems the chips are stacked against the rule of law and actual enforcement. And I don't really know how you deal with that from a comms perspective. It's definitely difficult, as we've seen and been frustrated with over the last few weeks.
Yeah, I think like what we've talked about in the past with, some of the Trump administration's comms, I think failures, I think this is another one, which is, again, like you said, Ryan, why Homan's coming in there, why Noem and some others are kind of leaving. I think like Kyle, talked about in his piece, I mean, this is an effort, a counterinsurgency, color revolution. I've heard kind of people debate those terms back and forth, whatever you want to call it. There are kind of normies kind of on the outside being, pulled in, soccer moms trying to be turned into basically revolutionaries like Renée Good was. especially if you read, Kyle's account of, the group that she joined, Minnesota, the anti-ICE group. But there, is a core group of people. I mean, there's Antifa. They're distributing what are called zines, which are kind of manuals that talk about everything from arson to train derailment. So, I mean, this is some serious stuff at the core. I mean, it really goes back to anarchist groups, people who, use Signal, obviously. And like you talked about, there are rumors that, Minnesota officials themselves are actually part of some of these Signal groups. The FBI is infiltrating them. They're investigating them right now. Cam Higby, who's a investigator on the ground, he's kind of the one who broke that story. So he said Democrat State Representative Alex Falconer said he's helping to run a resistance network through Signal. Amanda Kohler, who I guess served as a campaign strategist for Tim Walz, has been identified actually as an administrator on the Minnesota ICE Watch Signal chat group. There were rumors actually that even the lieutenant governor was actually even part of it or an administrator, but the little research I did I think was unfounded. But as you point out, Ryan, like, how do you actually defeat, this kind of systematic coordinated attack between nonprofits, between, NGOs, between people who are, giving money to this stuff? There was actually a really good Fox News article just a couple days ago about this guy. He's an American-born billionaire. I'd never heard of him. Neville Roy Singham, who I guess is a self-declared Marxist-Leninist living in Shanghai. He created this thing called the People's Forum Incorporated, which is some nonprofit hub, I guess, based out of New York City, that he's been funding since 2017 as some incubator for socialist, communist groups. And they run this outfit called Breakthrough News, which is a nonprofit, and it's basically a propaganda arm of the People's Forum, and that helps spread news of shooting and other activities. So you have all these things kind of coming together. And to me, it signals a bunch of things. First of all, which is this is the kind of coordinated stuff that Trump has to deal with, that past administrations and past, DHS members, didn't. So this is what happens when the rule of law, really goes, not supported for, many administrations. You talked about, Minnesota, especially that specific county where Minneapolis and St. Paul is. I think that's only one of 9 counties where ICE actually has any type of issue at all. And you have a core group of, I would say probably about 500 people who are really kind of doing this all, who are coordinating, who are giving their time and efforts to this. So, how do you smash this thing? It's a very difficult thing. Obviously, I think Trump has run into some issues, but, some of the changes, I think he can take a win saying, oh, look, I kind of forced a wedge between, Tim Walz and Jacob Frey and what they're doing. And, he's under my thumb now with, putting Homan now there, who, Homan's been, I think, served in multiple administrations in DHS. So he's a well-respected guy. And the midterms are still, fairly far away, too. So you just never know what's going to happen. But, Trump is weathering, a storm right now. We'll see if he can pull through. But it's definitely a precarious time for the administration.
The Substacker Morris, just quickly on that point, Mike. He's a student of public opinion tipping points, as he calls them. And he says they're rarely reversed, and he thinks this is one in Minneapolis. And his other examples are the Vietnam War and Walter Cronkite and Melee. And then Abu Ghraib and Iraq. So I don't render any judgments from that, whether he's right or wrong, but it's interesting. And you can understand the possibility that the American people have just had enough of this now at this point. And then what do you do if you're the Trump administration? To back down completely seems to hand victory to your enemies or your political adversaries domestically on an issue that you promised to succeed on and press aggressively. So there's a lot of tensions that they're having to juggle, obviously.
No, I think that's totally right. Because I've even seen, even in right-wing circles, kind of people backing down, and, the Wall Street Journal running this piece by the lawyer Jonathan Ross saying, oh, I can't believe what's happened here. I'm some, centrist rational Republican. So, yeah, you're having a big fight among the right even right now. A lot of, what certain people could term, black pill spiraling, saying Trump, just totally gave it away. He's a loser, etc. So you have this clearly tearing apart the right, too.
It's really hard, you guys. A few things can be true at once, right? Like, for me, the most reprehensible people here are just nakedly the Antifa operatives that Kyle Scheidler writes about. Like, there is no doubt that the hard left, the revolutionary left, plays dirty in exactly this way, and they do it by provoking more ordinary citizens to antagonize the cops and to get up in the cops' faces. And that is, to me, just foul. It's just a foul tactic, and it results in actual tragedy, actual hideous, kind of irrevocable loss of life. And I count Renée Good and Alex Pretti both kind of under that rubric. So that can be said, I think, at the outset. I'm quoting kind of off the top of my head here, so forgive me if I get this wrong, but Jim Hankins, who's written for both American Mind and Claremont Review of Books, and who has, I think, rather bravely taken a moderate stance on immigration in our pages and in our pixels. I say bravely because it's, we tend to be a more hardline publication. But he, as one of our discussions on this topic, was pretty, I think, middle of the road about, deport the criminals and then work your way toward contending with what's left. I saw him commenting on some of this Antifa stuff. And again, I think I'm getting this right. I think I saw him comparing it to Hamas. Like, you kind of get your own people to serve as these emblems, to manipulate and weaponize people's pity and all of that. I think, like, that's a pretty severe comparison coming from a guy who is not an immigration hawk. And I think there are, like, justifiable comparisons there. Not that this is like a full-fledged insurrectionist group necessarily, I'll leave it to others, I guess, to make those determinations. But just to say that this kind of weaponization of human life is, to me, like, beyond the pale of anything that we can reasonably argue about and discuss. It's just simply vile. And it breaks my heart. All of that having been said, right, that can be true at the same time as, and we've been, edging around this for a while, like, I think it's possible that the American people generally are just not where our hardliners are on immigration. Like, I think it's possible that they reacted with horror to the Biden crisis, and rightly, that there was an obvious catastrophe going on, a functionally open border, and the American people don't like that. They reacted very strongly against that. And Trump took this as a mandate on immigration, like, really, buckle down, close the border. People liked that. Get rid of the criminals. People liked that. It is possible that people don't like that much more than that, and that they are really not willing to go in like full deportation mode, even absent the bad action of the left. That the bad action of the left is taking advantage of something which also already exists, namely that kind of center of the country is more in the place of, like, well, a lot of these people were let in unjustly, but have become basically our friends and neighbors, and we don't have the heart or the stomach to just, totally reverse this influx. And I think, like, we may not like that. We might wish to make arguments in defense of a more robust deportation policy, but in the realities of Republican politics, like, it might be that we're going to have to figure out how to live with an America that basically wants to kind of assimilate a lot of people who were let in under unjust immigration regimes. I could be wrong about that, and, like, public opinion shifts wildly, but the numbers that Ryan is citing suggest to me that is about where people are landing and coming down, and that this is going to be, like, what Trump has to contend with going forward. And maybe I'm just working my, like, way around to saying he overplayed his hand. But I think that might be the case. Like, and as a noted immigration squish myself, maybe I'm arguing in like my own interests or whatever, but I don't think so. I think I'm just describing kind of where the middle is. And this is what Trump has had to contend with throughout his second term, that he got this resounding victory over an extremist left and interpreted that as like a maximal mandate, which is fair. But the victory was actually not delivered to him by like the opposite of the extremist left. It was delivered by a bunch of kind of common sense, intuitive vibes voters who are not, as we have repeatedly said on this show, like scrolling avidly through JD Vance's Twitter feed to figure out what the most base thing is that they should believe. And like keeping those two things separate is just part of the reality of Republican politics. I don't know. I mean, you guys can tell me I'm being too like backing down too easily, but it just seems like if it's getting this bad for Trump, there are some hard electoral realities that he may need to contend with at this point.
Yeah, the this is the last time I'll bring him up. The Substacker Morris, but his theory of the case, and he was just speculating, but it seems right to me. Is he said, look, it may turn out to be the case. This is a kind of a version of what you've been saying, Spencer, that the people who, a lot of them independents and new voters who propelled Trump into office on two issues, inflation and immigration. If you take the immigration part, what they really don't like and found appalling and a dereliction of duty on the part of the administration was huddled masses of illegal immigrants under bridges in Texas. What they, it seems like, did not sign up for was aggressive and sustained conflict-ridden deportation operations in major cities.
I think them be facts. I just think that's clear.
Right.
Yeah.
And look, Homan being sent in is an acknowledgement of this fact by Trump, I think, because the factions at DHS and within the immigration deportation policy folks in the administration, it's been reported that it was sort of Homan saying we need to focus on the worst criminals, and I've seen him say it in public. And a lot of our right-wing friends who think, no, we need to deport 10 million people over the next, two administrations, or we'll have no chance of saving our country, et cetera, et cetera. I think Homan, whatever he may think in his deep-held convictions on immigration, at least it seemed to him, and he's talked this way about it, you're going to lose the PR battle if you start going mass deportation quickly. You got to just focus on criminals. And so it's just I'm just embellishing what you've said, Spencer, over the last 5 or 6 minutes. But Homan seems to be evidence that Trump has maybe acknowledged this fact and wants to pivot in that direction.
And I've seen that. Yeah, I was going to bring up the factional dispute, too. There's a good Daily Wire piece about that. We're saying like Noam kind of represented. Corey Lewandowski, I think, too, is on this side. All guns blazing, 100% action. And Homan was a little bit more, I think, akin in acknowledging the political, I think, in this too, and just saying, look, the small sliver of people that are probably 100% for what the administration has been doing so far is probably a very small part of the electorate. So I think that Homan is probably just more political in that regard. I think it made sense for Trump to, see what was going on, kind of, change horses a bit in midstream. I think he's a political guy himself. He can clearly see, I think he's going to have some issues in the midterms. He sees internal polling, so he knows, kind of what's going on. I also wanted to bring up, speaking of kind of what this whole thing is, what's happening in Minneapolis, is it an insurgency? Is it a color revolution? There was a great series of posts on X by a guy named Eric Schwalm. He's a former Special Forces warrant officer.
This is what Hankins, I think, was responding to.
Yeah, so I'm sure that's probably who he was responding to. So he's got multiple rotations running counterinsurgency ops, and he just had a great series of posts. And the main thing he talked about was like, this is not, going back to what we were talking about before, this is not spontaneous outrage. This is C2, command and control with redundancy, OPSEC hygiene, task organization that would make a Special Forces team sergeant nod in recognition. Replace ICE agents with occupying coalition forces, and the structure maps almost one-to-one to early stage urban cells we hunted in the mid-2000s. So, I mean, this is a serious issue. It's not surprising in one respect that the Trump administration has had, a lot of trouble, I think, dealing with it. But that's why. It's just because this is such an issue that's been allowed to fester for a long time, especially when you have mayors and governors like Tim Walz, mayors like Frey, where you basically have almost, another regime forming in that state and in that city. So this is kind of another, problem of really the two regimes, the Republican regime of the founders and self-government and American patriotism. And then you have another one of, hatred for the country, hatred for its people, our traditions. And that's really kind of the battle of our times is who's going to win out.
Pick up on the normie vibes is like the motto, perhaps, of what I at least have been nudging us towards for Trump 2.0. The edgelordery comes back to bite you, I think, but we shall see. That's the one thing that's guaranteed. Let's talk about other people's problems, because I'm depressed thinking about America's problems.
One last thing on this, and I'll
please.
I would say if the flip side of successful mass deportations would be removing the magnet, both of new immigrants here, which Trump has seemed to has fixed just as a matter of border enforcement, and the sense that people will not be welcome and will be in a much more of a precarious position. But the other side is the employer side, and that would take an act of Congress and a major sea change in how a good portion, on how the GOP and some right-leaning Democrats think about this issue. I just want to remind everyone that this was the original plan with Reagan's 88 amnesty, or was it 86? I can never remember, which was the amnesty, but enforcement also. And quickly the administration came to learn, and people trying to enforce it also came to learn, that the way our kind of civil rights architecture worked as it had evolved since the Civil Rights Act of 1964, through the courts and through the bureaucracy, basically made the enforcement side, especially empowering employers and then protecting them from asking the sorts of questions and cracking down on them on the employment side of immigration. It made most of that illegal. And this is a part of a theme of our colleague Chris Caldwell's book, Age of Entitlement. So this problem is very old. And so if you wanted a somewhat more accelerated removal of people, you have to dry up their sources of livelihood and remittances back home and all the rest, which means going after the employer side of illegal immigration. And I know the Trump administration, especially in the first few months or the first 6 months, tried to do some crackdowns at work sites to help this process along. If you really want to fix this problem, and I think many on the right think it's an absolute necessity for a stable republic going forward, that is to say, the removal of a good portion of the illegals that have come here over the last 30 years or so, you have to get Congress involved. And those who look at Congress, especially in its current, Republican majority of 2 seats because of there was another death a few months ago on the GOP side, that's going to have to wait for another day, unfortunately.
I think this is kind of the way to go, and it might help redirect some of the maximalist energy of our friends on the right to more productive areas. Like, to get Caldwell upheld is to become, an extremist about the civil rights regime as it has hardened into the administrative state. And there's like a lot of quite intense work that you could do there that would piss off the left just fine, if that's kind of our aim here, and probably help a lot to kind of buy us the breathing room we need to assimilate our new arrivals, if that's kind of, if that's where we're gonna go. Okay, now let's talk about other people's problems. This will pick up on some stuff we talked about last year. And speaking of getting Caldwell upheld, actually, it was a big cover essay in CRB that kind of kicked off our interest, I guess, in this. Chris Caldwell, excellent watcher of Europe, spent some time examining what's gone on in the UK and came back with some really fascinating conclusions, including that the hate speech regime, if you like, the really tight controls on what can and can't be said, has helped to create a kind of secret or invisible radicalization of the populist wing in the UK, which of course is incensed, among other things, by their own immigration crisis, which is I would say, quite a bit more severe than our own for a number of reasons. One of which is that it has carried on unabated from government to government, conservative and liberal. In fact, one of the terms that Caldwell excavated for us was the term Boris wave, which describes a major influx of immigrants during Boris Johnson's tenure as prime minister. And this, again, has created a kind of coded or covert populist right in the UK, which is quite extreme. Extreme is the wrong word. Quite intense. It's radical in the basic sense of the word. So that's what's been going on. We've had some writing also by Noel Yaxley in The American Mind about this. And Ryan circulated for us as a jumping off point to check in again this piece by Sam Friedman in Substack called "Who Runs Britain?" And this is more about, if there is populist discontent fomenting in Britain, what would be the channels to move it through? How could change actually get done? And I'm making it more about populism than Friedman's piece is. I'm sort of interpreting what he has to say in this particular domain. But his broader overall point is that you're starting to hear a lot of UK politicians, including prime ministers and former prime ministers, talking the way American politicians talk about the regulatory state and the administrative state. In other words, saying, I would like to deliver on X or Y policy, but I can't get anything done. And Friedman just points out, a prime minister is not a president. It's one of the most empowered executives, assuming Parliament's behind the prime minister. He or she is empowered to get things done. So what is it exactly that's standing in the way of sort of the appetite, public desire for policy change and the actual enactment of policy change? Comes up with a number of different answers that I think we could talk about. The key line in here that I just think is really telling is frustrations with the machine have gotten worse even as executive authority has increased. And I'll just say one of the accounts he gives of why this is, and that's from a guy called Michael Moran, who talks about the regulatory state. And he makes this wonderful comparison. So he says that before the turbulence of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a lot of Britain was run a little bit like a London club. And it's particularly funny because I am, right after recording this podcast, I'm going to go teach a class on the fourth book of Plato's Republic. And one of the things that Socrates says in there is there's no point regulating gentlemen. In other words, he ends up basically saying we don't need to write that many laws if we just refine and educate our ruling classes to be decent, essentially, which is an interesting idea to consider, especially because one of the things that Friedman suggests here is that the London Club was insufficient to run a modern state. And so what you got instead was the regulatory state, which is this kind of faceless, rules-based bureaucracy that operates on its own terms and seems often to kind of countermand or contradict the elected government. I'm going to kick this to you, Ryan, first, because you were just in London. I'm scheduled to go to London in a couple weeks and curious what your thoughts were in, visiting again. How does it look to you? And what do you think the prospects are for some kind of serious reform in the UK under the conditions that Friedman describes?
Yeah, well, marrying this piece, which I thought was interesting, really just skims the surface, but has a nice way of outlining the problems. And Britain's an interesting case study for America because, at least from the terms of this article, and I'm not an expert on it at all, although I've observed their problems with their bureaucracy in recent decades, especially around Brexit and their fairly successful efforts by their deep state to deep six Brexit, and to a certain extent. The UK is an interesting case study because it's a smaller version of the US's bureaucratic problems. It's claimed in the article that this really started getting out of hand only in the 70s, which, though our administrative state predates the 1960s and 70s in America, it really didn't start exploding. And at the beginning of its expansion to its current scope and intrusiveness and insulation in America, it really went on overdrive in the 60s and 70s also. So and I suspect that may be true across the Western world. So I think it has a lot to do with the university system and the merging of technocratic education across the West. That's just my hypothesis. I haven't tested it, but we've gotten much more homogenous in our credentialing institutions. We've talked about that in America, and I think it's also true in the UK. My time there, I had the opportunity to speak with one of the young members of the House of Lords in his early 30s. And, I think thinks a lot like politics and populism and immigration along the lines we do. I won't out him because I didn't tell him I was going to bring him up. But he said, the civil service, the bureaucracy, a lot of it would just go along and run the state. The really ideological part of it, and I suspect this is true in the States as well. In fact, I know it's probably mostly true. It's really the top tier of them who have great influence and agenda that are the real problem. That's the case in Britain, but it's a much smaller place, of course, than the United States. And it's much more centralized. I mean, there's the UK is spread out across, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England, but it's really run from London and London's appendages and the NGO complex and the bureaucracy in many ways is at the heart of it. There's a remarkable detail that he reported. Their bureaucracy there seems to be, even though it's a smaller place, more disjointed and there's less of an ability, especially for number 10, that is the Prime Minister's office, to oversee it all, which comes up in this article that you referenced, Spencer. And just the one example that he gave about it was they found this one senior bureaucrat who you have a lot of these isolated regulatory bodies, and the senior bureaucrats make pretty good money along the lines of senior bureaucrats in the United States. And he was collecting, I think, 6 or 7 paychecks from 6 or 7 different jobs and making £750,000 a year. And no one had noticed. And he was being held to account for it. And, it was going to be a problem for him. They were going to finally fix that problem. But it was just that one data point about the problem that the UK faces. And I thought it was extraordinary in the Substack piece you mentioned, Spencer, that, the Prime Minister's office has about 200 staff to oversee all of this. So it's outgunned managerially, while at the same time, the Prime Minister has taken on more of the trappings of a head of state, or as he said, the presidentialization of the Prime Minister's office. So he's more distracted. He's at all these international conferences, which, past prime ministers would have done that too. But the calls on his time, him right now, of course, being Keir Starmer, but take your pick in recent years, have grown. The staff is incapable of focusing on this wide regulatory apparatus. And so you have this problem in the UK of the disjunction, as you do in America, between a lot of policymaking and rulemaking and the people clamoring for their elected officials and their presidents and or prime ministers to do something about it, and those executives running into all sorts of problems trying to do something about it. Now, I'll stop by saying in the UK, the solution is much easier because of parliamentary supremacy, which Chris Caldwell brought up in his essay from a few issues ago about will there be another England? With parliamentary supremacy, you can do a lot if you have a commanding parliamentary majority. In fact, you can do almost anything. The old joke is that Parliament can do anything besides make a man a woman or a woman a man. And so it's much more fixable and much more quickly in the UK, both because of its size, but also because of its institutional arrangements. So at some point in the near future, you will see a reform Tory coalition, I suspect. Electoral life is not long for the Labour Party, although these things can grind on for a few more years before an election absolutely has to be called, just given the nature of British politics. So Starmer and his Labour government may limp along for a while longer and maybe do some reforming in the process. But I suspect a big, I'll put it this way. Any pro-Britain, anti-illegal immigration, anti-foreigner influx populist movement on the right in the UK, I should hope, would think about that, but think about using that as a wedge issue or a supercharger over a larger reform effort of bringing, the term means something a little different in the UK, but bringing their government back under some constitutional control after years and years of bureaucratic bloat. So it was a very interesting case study. And you also see in the UK, as we've mentioned in previous episodes, the rise of alternative right-wing media and J'accuse or Pimlico Journal, these Substack domains. Also, this other one that I learned of fairly recently, Guido Fawkes, which is another, that is FAWKES, another alternative media source. So you have a lot of the same energy roiling British politics that you do in the United States. It's just inflected through a British lens and freighted with their history, constitutional and otherwise. So it's not a one-to-one comparison, but I think we can learn a lot. And in fact, we need to start learning a lot more from truly not in the political sciencey lame, lame modern quantitative analysis sense, but in the true older sense of real comparative politics across the West. And I think a good topic of study would be the ways in which these bureaucratic systems envelop and muddle the people's control over their governments across the Anglosphere, but not just the Anglosphere, Western Europe and the United States and Canada in general. If we did more of that work, and I think more of it is going to be forthcoming, I think we'd learn a lot. And we'd each learn about how to reform our own systems more effectively. And we'd learn how better to deal with our allies, which the recent dust up over Greenland and hyperventilation about the future of NATO, to the contrary notwithstanding, we need allies in Western Europe if we're going to successfully face down our adversaries, both economically and strategically in East Asia and elsewhere. So lots of work to do and lots of thinking to be done. So this is just one data point that brought it all to my mind.
I think one of the good things about the article, the Substack piece, is, just kind of reading about how a lot of this, the explosion of the regulatory state in Britain, I mean, it was really actually a lot later than I had assumed, the 70s and 80s. I was surprised they hadn't gone to even the 50s, to pinpoint kind of where some of the problems started. And they may have started in some way, shape, or form, but, really it's the 70s that I think is the big problem. And like kind of Ryan indicated, I mean, we're talking about a Supreme Court case coming up where, could change things for the better and really start to pare back the administrative state, overturning a case that was done in 1935 in Humphrey's executor. So we have a much longer lineage, unfortunately, of many constitutional issues. You go back, I mean, even to Woodrow Wilson, the Federal Trade Commission, to the income tax, I think, in 1913. So, I mean, our problems, and that's why one of the things that makes it reform harder in America is not only, the system of government we have, which is not exactly what the founders and their generations bequeathed to us, but you have this whole kind of fourth branch of government, this kind of headless state that's kind of there too, this kind of shadow government. And that makes it all, exponentially harder, I think. In the UK, I mean, they've had kind of it rough. I mean, I remember when, Trump came up in his first term, you kind of had Boris Johnson there, and people kind of assumed, oh, here we go. He's the, the British Trump, and that did not exactly, was not exactly borne out by what happened with that administration and then other ones too. But I think this article points out, I think some interesting things as Substack. It points to kind of the three major issues. The role of the prime minister, obviously, as Spencer said, has become kind of more presidential in the modern sense, not exactly as, say, Article 2 of the Constitution. And really, Downing Street is still operating, or the operation is still designed for the era of cabinet government. You do have the rise of the regulatory state, which really they pinpoint actually when it really accelerated was with the rise of Tony Blair and New Labour. So that was even in the mid to late 90s. And then with that, you had an enormous surveillance apparatus that was created kind of in an ad hoc fashion. You have all these formerly kind of private bodies that are now kind of overseen by regulatory professions. You have Also, too, third, in kind of this kind of idea of federalism, too, this collapse of state capacity at the local and regional levels, where you have public services basically being run by some kind of central power, central apparatus that really has no idea what's actually happening in kind of those two spheres. And he really says, I mean, the focus, needs to be put on the disconnect between power and capacity rather than power per se. And I think that's an important part too. I've noticed just in commentary, even here about, American politics, especially when you read in evangelicals trying to discuss it, it's all about somehow lowering of power or setting aside power will help, which is just not the case at all. I think it's power well used. It has to be channeled and guided and directed. And you have to have decentralization, which I think is partly a solution here too. It's not the solution, but certainly one of them. Moving some of these agencies, the FBI, et cetera, out of DC possibly. And that's been talked about for a long time. But I think the lesson in comparative politics is a good one that, we can look at this situation. I think, although, the British are in a different situation, I mean, there are some similarities and they're kind of ahead. And obviously we don't want to go where they're at. I think without some serious immigration reform, talking about assimilation, some serious improvements to civics, we could, but I think we can use it as a cautionary tale to say, let's not go that route. Let's go another path.
I don't have too terribly much to add to all of that, except that in the same discussion that leads Socrates to say that it's pointless to. What he actually says is uk axion. It's not appropriate or fitting or just. Uk axion tois andrasi kalois kagathois to epitatein, to lay down rules for good and noble men. So that's the conversation that arises after Socrates has already said that probably the biggest you can make a just regime is the size of about 1,000 members of the ruling class, 1,000 guardians. And after that, they start to form little factions within themselves, and you have more than one city in the space of the same area. So if it's true that the London Club rules weren't sufficient to govern, the Britain of the 20th and 21st centuries, maybe this is why. Maybe part of the challenge we're facing is that as, the televisual age rolled on and the post-war era brought about these kind of global powers and conflicts between them and delicate balance among them, and as the modern nation state became this huge industrial behemoth, we were faced with a number of regime level questions about how to organize ourselves that we just kind of answered wrongly in the civil rights era. Just a thought. And that what might need revision is, and from a standpoint of real consideration about what justice looks like in the modern industrial regime, what might need revision is just how we organize ourselves so that we are not ruled over by many, many more than 1,000 kind of unaccountable bureaucrats, but are rather handing off our own, according to our republic, our own sovereignty to people whose faces we can identify and whose names we know.
Yeah, I mean, these eruptions, in a way that we've described in the UK and the US, the big expansions of modern bureaucratic state as we know it, especially its intrusions into all sorts of domestic policy, may have happened in the 60s and 70s, give or take change. But as Mike alluded to, the architecture is much older. We talk about Woodrow Wilson, but of course Wilson was a great student of Hegel's. Now Hegel, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel to be exact, writing in the late 19th century, had this grand theory of the state and how really we can see it all now because we stand at the end of history. That is, we finally progress to this beautiful picture, at least theoretically. He was I should say that he was not identifying modern Prussia as exactly this, but he thought all government was trending towards this, which was a rational constitutional monarchy by which you have public opinion, you have the different classes, you have corporations, you have civil society, all these things working together. The invention of private property, the bigger space for the private sphere, contracts, all that's great. It's sort of the evolution of government from the ancient world up until late 19th century Prussia. But Hegel said, we're finally seeing what it's all going to look like now, which is all of these competing interests, very particular interests, merging together into and getting refracted through this civil bureaucratic mechanism and through separation of powers and different divisions of government, that is the legislative and the executive, particularly, he was talking about. If it all works well and we do our work right and we educate people correctly, we will have the rational state. Everyone's jostling particular interests and rights and subjective notions will be refracted through this state apparatus, and we'll have rational policy making. Everyone will be happier, more prosperous, and we'll finally do scientific government. He didn't quite talk that way about government, but it's kind of what he meant. And instead, what has happened was a lot of the insights of the ancient polis. I'm glad you brought up Plato, Spencer, and Aristotle, and the tendencies and intractability of human nature and the temptations and the problem of the passions. Those things had not been solved by Hegel's time, though he thought they had been to a certain extent. And in many ways, the problems of politics, the difficulty of justice, and the ever-present temptation of various actors to feather their own nests and gather their own power, and to do precisely the opposite of what Hegel hoped, which was to think in a grand public-spirited and public good-oriented direction to finally bring about wonderful, rational, and good government. It all came to naught, and it doesn't work. And so we're left with maybe the least bad option, which is kind of what you're always left with in politics, which might be something a little more like the constitutional monarchy, warts and all, of, say, I don't know, early 20th century Great Britain, or the representative governmental system that stretches maybe, say, from in the U.S., warts and all, one very large particular wart, which everyone knows in particular, of course, but a government controlled by its people and responsive to their ultimate sovereignty. Is it messy? Yes. Do you get rational policy? Always no. Do the experts get to carry the day? No. But you get everyone exercising together to preserve their own republic, and it might be the best we can do.
You're here. Quite so. And we wouldn't have wanted to end this without talking about Hegel. That actually sounds a lot like a review that I'm editing right now, funnily enough, for the new CRB. There's a Harvey Mansfield has a new book coming out, The Rise and Fall of Rational Control. So it's basically about exactly what you just described, Ryan. And it sounds like Mansfield starts with Machiavelli, and in particular his Mandragola, which is a play that not a lot of people read, but it's kind of interesting, and then goes through, from Machiavelli to Nietzsche and Hegel, and on into the present, which definitely sounds like a book I want to read, but also, yes, is confirmed by what you just said.
And I would just say, for people with strong stomachs, and to say a word in defense of Hegel, not necessarily his plan of government, but he's one of the most thorough theorizers of this, the possibility of doing this well. And he had tried to think through all of the objections and how all of this fits together. So if you want the pristine presentation of it and you have the stomach for it, he's a German, so you got to get used to the jargon and stuff. It's not as bad as Heidegger, I promise you. Very different project, in fact. But Introduction to the Philosophy of Right. It's all there. He shows how it should all stick together, how it should all work ideally. And he's not a bad guy. He just got some fundamentals wrong about history and human nature, we think.
And if that's all anyone can say of any of us, we'll be lucky. Okay, we usually close out the show with some cultural recommendations, but I think since we don't really have time to do our third topic, I'm going to turn that into our little cultural check-in. This is the second half of my off-color joke at the beginning. When I said that ice was killing people, I meant not just ice the the branch, the law enforcement agency, but also ice, as in the element. There was a massive storm Fern, that swept across most of the South, although a lot of places have been getting hit by it. As of this recording, which we're doing on Tuesday, I'm reading in the New York Times that there are still 700,000 homes and businesses without power. At least 22 deaths, maybe 9 others that we can attribute to the storm of hypothermia and other casualties. Over 800,000 outages initially per Fox News. And I don't know how I'm going to cope with this, but I now know that we live in a world where trees can explode. I knew previously that we lived in a world with degenerative disease and unjust killings and all sorts of other nasties, but I at least had thought that the trees were safe from explosion. Turns out not. Turns out they can get so cold that their sap freezes and expands. I think that's how it works. That's I've done some quick science, and I think that's what's going on. Anyway, basically, I'm inviting us each to just check in and see how the storm has hit you guys. Mike, I think you might have the worst of it over there.
Yeah, I mean, looking outside now, I think we almost got a foot, which for Cincinnati, I mean, Southern Ohio, right by the Ohio River, right by Kentucky, is just historic. That just doesn't happen here. I grew up in the Cleveland area, so we were used to, 100 inches of snow a year. That was no problem. Lake effect coming off of Lake Erie, that was very typical. But here, even on, I think, Monday morning, I mean, you're talking about major interstates. One lane of the highway, I think, was kind of partially open, and that was it. So schools were canceled, businesses were closed. My church canceled services on Sunday, as did pretty much most in the area. So it was a major storm. The problem here is it's going to be compounded by, and I'm sure elsewhere, very, very cold weather. I think I just saw on one of my weather apps, it's going to go down to -16 on Thursday night, I think, here, that's also unheard of too. So so we're not quite out of the woods yet. Our driveway got plowed, so that's all done. So we can certainly exit the house and all that. Our street isn't too bad, but it's it was a major storm that had is continuing to have some consequences.
Yeah, I gather there's like a bomb cyclone ahead too. Yeah, Ryan.
Yeah, so here in North Texas, it got about as cold, close to as cold as it gets around here, and the most snowy-ish precipitation that we usually get. We had a little bit of snow, a day and a half's worth last February or late January, but that melted pretty quickly. This is stuck around a little bit. We got maybe 3 inches, and it all blows around, so it's higher in certain spots. But the overnight lows, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, were in the single digits. So the real worry was that we were going to have freezing rain, and if you get a half an inch of freezing rain, it messes with all the power lines. And there's been some power outages in North Texas, but not that bad, especially compared to their big ice storm that killed like 200 people back in 2021. So all in all, it didn't turn out too bad. It's just the plowing infrastructure around here is not what it is in the Midwest. So there are some plows around, but basically it's sleeting. It was sleet and snow, and then very cold overnight temperatures. So everything just turned to snowy ice. It's hard. It's slick. I had to drive to the office yesterday, which is usually about 15 minutes, just because I left something here stupidly. And my average speed was probably 7 miles an hour because it was literally like a lot of portions of the roads, especially the shady parts with overhanging trees. I mean, it was 18 degrees. So it was like driving across an ice skating rink. So it's when you're going down a hill and using the engine to brake, and you just have to make sure that you're going straight and you don't turn and you don't accelerate, and then you will slide in a straight line down the hill. Luckily, hardly anyone was driving, so I made it all right with just a little bit loss of traction at key points. But today is much better. It's starting to melt. It's in the 40s. So it was fun for the kids. They canceled class for 2 days, including today, because icy mornings are, of course, terrible for school buses and any teachers commuting in, even though now it's melting and it's getting much better. But the kids ended up having a lot of fun going to the elementary school playground behind the house and sliding on boogie boards down the hill and generally having a good time. But not normal for these parts to get 3 inches that sticks around for 3 days and turns to ice.
Yeah, we
But
had a
luckily,
snow
the
day.
worst did not come to pass.
Yes, that was lucky. We had a snow day out here too. I'm learning from this, or perhaps relearning, that whatever amount of infrastructure there is in any given US city, it's just not quite enough for the amount of weather that that city gets. So if you live in a place where it almost never snows, you get one heavy snow a year, guaranteed you do not have any snowplows or enough snowplows to take care of that one snow. If you live in a place where it snows all throughout the winter, but there's a few weeks of really intense ice and wind and cold, guaranteed you will run out of salt and snowplows, and your power grid will go down. So this is a problem. I don't know whom we need to contact to fix this. I suspect that a lot of it has to do with the foolhardy push to move away before the economy was ready from like gasoline and fossil fuels, but I'm no expert in that domain. I will just say that I'm in Austin, where I stayed over this past weekend. Back in Nashville, where it gets much colder, it truly looks like a disaster zone. I mean, there's power lines down all over the city. There's like road signs, highway signs that have collapsed onto trucks in the middle of the street. Here, it was like kind of slippery and a little cold, but it seems like both cities have completely shut down as in response, because according to the Clavin principle, neither one of them has quite enough resources to deal with however much we happen to be getting.
In defense of DFW, I will say though, I think it's just an exercise in to defend. I'm not defending the rational state here, but the calculation seems to me to be, to maintain the sort of snow plow and salting infrastructure, all the trucks and all that stuff, would be a massive waste of money in DFW because it just doesn't happen that often. So I think they've decided, and everyone seems to navigate around it, that, you're just going to have to put up with a few days where everything shuts down. Then everyone gets back to normal. And to have the maximal preparation for all this would be too expensive. Now, having said all that, maybe AI and drones and all this could fix this problem. I can envision some snow drones salting the roads, maybe not plowing, but eventually, why not? I mean, if a Waymo can pick you up down in Austin, Spencer, I don't see why we couldn't have high traction, low cost, non-people manned snowplows when everyone else is in their home. So maybe we're on the cusp of a great renaissance in state capacity. No, I don't think so.
Can we get them with those cute little digital hearts for eyes, like the little trucks that deliver food around the city? Because I'd be down for that. My ride in a Waymo, I will talk about that on another cultural recommendation, because I have to say it was pretty cool, despite the fact that it was also profoundly dystopian and made me feel that maybe not only will we one day be in a time when transportation is rationed by the faceless tech overlords, we may already be in that time. So with that cheery thought, let's close out another episode, and I'm going to go teach the Republic. Thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to know more about anything we've talked about or anything else that we do at Claremont Institute, you can visit our websites at the American Mind, americanmind.org, and at the Claremont Review of Books, ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, where you can sign up to become a subscriber. You can take a look at our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. And of course, you can donate to support us, which we would greatly appreciate at claremont.org/donate. If you want to be shouted out on the show, just mention that in the notes and we will do it happily. Thanks to our production crew, the brothers Gannon, Jake, and Ryan Gannon, newly Mr. Ryan Gannon, Esquire. I suppose he was already Mr. Ryan Gannon, but what I'm trying to say is that he got married and we're very happy for him. And we also can't survive without him. So we're very glad he's back. Don't forget to rate, review, share, subscribe. Let everyone know about this podcast. It really helps spread the word and hopefully benefits our new listeners as well. Thanks very much once again for listening, and we will talk to you next week.